So in our final model, we are going to do our best to show all the different types of cells that are involved in healing, with the goal of showing how healing happens at the cellular level. So first we need to think about what are the different types of cells that we're going to show. Well, one of the first things that we know happened to our student is that he had a broken bone in his foot. Not only was it fractured, but there was also movement of the bone so that it was not in the proper spot. Now we're going to do a lot of zoom ins on these different types of cells so that we can better see them. So in the bone, we had a fracture and it was misaligned. That's how we knew it was injured. Now, when we talked about bone cells have a structure, characteristics that are kind of like round with circles inside of circles. And so these bone cells, their function is to provide structure and shape to the body. And we know that the bones were injured because of the fracture and the misalignment detected on the x-ray. And we know that these bone cells, in order for them to heal, would need to be able to replicate and divide and make new ones. We're going to show that at the end because this is going to be a theme where all of these different cells are going to need to make more of themselves to make new cells for healing. So we'll get to that. Another part of the body that we knew was injured were the muscles. So muscles, there was probably a tear, but the muscles were torn, and we had limited movement. So to do a zoom in, we know that muscle cells are kind of long and stringy with space between them. And so these muscle cells must have had some damage since there was limited movement. And we know that the function of muscle cells are to allow for movement in the body. So if some of these cells were damaged, again, they're going to have to replicate, divide to make new ones. We'll get back to that. Another part of the body that we know was injured as a result of this injury to the foot were the skin cells. There were cuts or lacerations. So the skin had cuts in it on the top of the foot. So to do a zoom in on our skin cells, they kind of look like scales, river rocks, with little space between them, kind of round or ovular. And the function of these skin cells is to provide kind of a protective layer contain the inside structures and to keep out the outside. So those skin cells must have been damaged because there were cuts or openings in the skin. Therefore, we needed to see that some of them would fill the gap by replicating, dividing, and making new ones. Another cell that we have in our foot that we think had some injury to it were the nerves. If you remember, on the top of his foot, there was no feeling. Pardon my spelling. No feeling on the top of the foot, and we think that's because of the nerves. I'm going to do a zoom in so we can show what nerves look like. Remember, nerves have a central body with kind of branches coming out to them. They are not in isolation. They are typically with other nerves because their function is to send and receive messages. Sorry about that. To the nerves and brain. Since there was no feeling in the nerves, there must have been damage to the nerves. So nerve cells would need to replicate, divide, and make more of themselves in order to have the injury heal. One of the other structures that we talked about being part of this healing process was the blood. Not only was some blood probably coming out from the skin, but we also know that there was a lot of swelling in the area. And what we learned is that swelling is from excess fluid and blood coming to the area. So let's focus in on blood. If I do a zoom in, on blood, let's make this clear that it's blood, I would see a bunch of different structures. I would see red blood cells that would be bringing oxygen to the area. I would see some white blood cells, which tend to be spherical and kind of larger. They respond to disease. Or injury. And I would see some platelets. They've got those tentacle-like arms. And when they come together, they allow for clotting. They were probably really important with that blood stopping. So the blood was important too because it helped with healing the injury by bringing nutrients to the area that cells need in order to make more of themselves. So let's kind of focus in on that process. So we said that in order for the bones to heal, the nerves to heal, the skin and the muscles to heal, all of that requires new cells to be formed. And so new cells were formed. In order to have new cells form, you need a pre-existing cell. We're just drawing kind of a generic cell, so an old cell. It needs to take in nutrients, which it's likely getting from the blood. Let me emphasize with the blood that there's some plasma too. It's the liquid with nutrients. Once that cell has the nutrients that it needs, it's able to take that information in its nucleus, its chromosomes, Chromosomes are copied. They move to other ends of the cell. And then it divides into two new cells, each with the same amount of information, same shape as the original cells. Now this happened with bones, with muscles, with skin, and nerves. It took time, it took nutrients from the body, but over time, with the support of some medical intervention, like we read about in the studies, there would be new cells forming that fill in the gap. So for example, in the skin, if you had an injury, you might have a gap in cells. It would lead to healed because new cells would fill in that gap through this process of cell replication and division. So that's happening all the time in our body for our growth, but especially happening during the healing process when new cells are needed.